I'm here today with Libby Littlewood, and I'm super excited to talk to you, Libby. You have sort of the nightmare story that I've been fighting against and fighting to try and get information out about because so many people deny that what happened to you is actually happening. And so I'm grateful that you're willing to share your story, and I'm hoping that it will educate people as to how dangerous the affirmative care model for kids with gender confusion who identify as transgender is. So let's get started. Can you just tell me about your story?
Okay, yeah. So in general, I grew up in a Christian home. I sort of I had my parents were together. I was bullied a bit in primary school, and then sort of towards the end of primary school, my parents split up. And I think it was sort of somewhere towards the beginning of high school was when I started to really experience really intense gender dysphoria. And I didn't know what it was. I couldn't connect with the girls in school, and I could really connect a lot better with the boys. But I was also, I wasn't like the stereotypical tomboy who hates femininity. So I just didn't have any like female role to connect with. And then I kind of researched into what my feelings were and all these symptoms I was having with like dissociation, and I didn't feel like I was a girl and all these kinds of things. And all of a sudden, I discovered transgenderism. I was about 12 years old. And I discovered, oh, this could be a thing. And I kind of struggled against it for about 5 years or so, in the process of which my parents took me to my doctor and I got counseling. And I was kind of going for counseling, like in my mind, I wanted to be able to alleviate the dysphoria and explore any option I could go through without transitioning. And the therapy was actually quite a lot more on the affirmative. There are trans people, we just want to make sure whether you're really a trans person kind of doctrine. And so at that point, my mum died when I was 14. I was 17 when I, in the end, actually just transitioned, and I've kind of gone back and forth a little bit, cross-dressed a bit, used a different name a bit as a teenager, but I really just kind of submitted to it when I was 17, because I'd been taught for so long that if things don't improve, then that's the reason and that's the thing that needs to change. And so because of the links that I had and the history I had, the medical history I had of receiving this therapy for gender dysphoria at a young age, I basically managed to get through the gender care system, like pathway on the NHS, relatively quickly. I started taking male hormones when I was 18, and I lived as a man in total for about 5 or 6 years until this December just gone, when I was convicted by God in a really sort of prophetic way, and now I'm adjusting myself to living as a female again.
So you, it sounds like, are sort of the least likely to actually accept this narrative that you could be born in the wrong body because of your Christian upbringing. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it seems like
progressive Christians.
Okay, I was going to say that a lot of, I guess maybe that's the difference, is that a lot of this might depend on how your family responds to your feelings, and if the idea that you could be born in the wrong body is even entertained by those around you, including your therapist.
Yeah, especially when you're a teenager. If you think, like, I was receiving therapy between the ages of 12 and 15, and if you say to a kid who's struggling, and I mean, I was obviously, the dysphoria was real, the dissociation was real, the depression and the anxiety were real things, and being kind of told that was, those are symptoms of dysphoria, you could be dysphoric, and basically, like, this is a problem that you either have or you don't have. like, try saying that to any kind of like young teenager that's suffering, and it's basically like you're baiting them towards saying, yes, I am transgender, I am this is something that I am struggling with, because otherwise it makes it seem to them like there is no issue otherwise, like they're not being taken seriously.
And I think that that's so important to note, that these kids who are struggling. I mean, when I was a kid, I had serious issues. I was dissociating. I had depression. I had anxiety, and part of that, was that was the foundation of my gender dysphoria. It was called gender identity disorder back when I was a kid, but it was a way for me to completely distance myself from the me that I was having such a hard time living as. And it sounds like that was very similar to what happened with you.
Yeah, I think it was because it was such a long journey. I had 5 years of sort of struggling against it before I finally submitted to transitioning. So for me, there are 5 years worth of different issues that happened. So I've mentioned my parents splitting up, I mentioned my mum dying, and I mentioned homelessness. Those three things happened between, for me, the ages of 11 and 16. And then once I was homeless, there were a slew of other things that you could expect a 16-year-old girl while homeless to experience that maybe a 16-year-old boy wouldn't experience. So,
And that's I think something that's so critical for people to understand about rapid onset gender dysphoria in girls, is that so often I think that it's linked to these experiences that are really relegated to being a vulnerable female in our society. And transitioning is a way to run away from that, and really it's almost like a way to find safety in a scary world for some kids.
yeah, I think especially the kind of people that I was sort of around when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, were a lot of people with a lot of issues. And I was almost sort of thrust into the LGBT community because I had to drop out of sixth form college because I was homeless, and I stayed homeless for about 11 months. And the people that sort of gravitated towards me at this point, and that I gravitated towards, were people with family problems, people with mental health problems, and a surprising amount of those had LGBT identities. They identified as transgender or as gay or as lesbian or bisexual. They were really sexually active. Some of them were like really a lot older than me as well. There were people who were like 28 and were still living in that kind of way. That there were 16-year-olds around them doing the same things. And that encouraged sort of the thought process of like, this is a male, this is a female. Males sexualize females, females sexualize males. And if you're not doing that, then you're gay and you're sexualizing same sex. And if you're not gay, and I've never really been a very lustful person or a very sexual person. So if I didn't fit into that kind of dynamic, it was kind of I had these two options. Do you want to be this like sexualized version of a female, or do you want to be this hypersexualized version of a male? And the male one was a lot more attractive than the female one.
Well, it gave you the opportunity to have a little bit more safety.
Yeah, definitely. And also to be more respected for the person that I was rather than my body. And I think being 16 years old, not even finishing puberty yet, and kind of having adult men stare at your body and vocally like really just comment about it so outright, and sort of say that you must be interested in stereotypical female things because you're a woman, and if you're not, then you will be one day, and that kind of thing. It was, it wasn't the true what being male or female is. It was these stereotypes.
And that's what really bothers me a lot, is that kids are being given the impression that if they don't adhere to really rigid gender stereotypes, that they're actually transgender. And to me, that is just incredibly dangerous to tell kids. And and the premise that you can be born in the wrong body, as you know, that these behaviors or feelings indicate that there's something inherently wrong with you, and that you should try to do whatever you can to change your external presentation. And one of the things that you mentioned to me was that your therapist diagnosed you as, I think it was you that said that you were diagnosed as being asexual or demisexual, or
But yeah, so there was, this is one of the things that kind of I experienced, and I want to make the point, this was 2009. This was
so it was a
not
while ago.
a few years ago. Yeah, this was over a decade ago, when things were not to the extreme point they're at now, and it was still at that level back then. What they would do is they would ask you sort of a series of questions to try and get a feel for whether you are really transgender, or whether maybe you're struggling with your sexual orientation, or maybe maybe it's something like you just wanted to be transgender and you weren't transgender, or something like that. And one of the questions they would ask is, what is your sexuality? And I was 12 years old, and so I'd been on Tumblr, and I'd researched a bit of like what sexuality is in that kind of like ideology, and I came out with this sort of definition of panromantic demisexual, which, as I understood it and as it had been defined to me on social media, was somebody who did not discriminate against gender when it came to a romantic relationship, who was not actively pursuing sex, but who would, out of obligation of kindness, allow another person to have sex with them if that person wanted to, and they loved that person.
At 12.
At 12, I was exposed to that ideology, and I was asked what my sexuality was, and I said I'm panromantic demisexual, and I basically explained it as that. I explained it as, I'm open to having a relationship with a male or a female if I were attracted to a male or a female, or anything in between was kind of like the doctrine. But and back then that included intersex people, because the gender fluid thing was not a thing yet. But and the demisexual thing, I genuinely did explain as like, I'm not interested in sexual relationships, but I would allow a person to have a sexual relationship with me.
And one of the things that really concerns me, I actually was sexual by the time I was 12. I had cultivated lesbian relationships when I was in elementary school because I wanted to present as male. And that was part of my identity, was having sexual relationships with females. And what concerns me a lot about the narrative now is that therapists are discouraged and sometimes banned from working with kids regarding their sexual orientation as well as their gender. And in the case of a child like you or a child like me, where you said you were basically telling the counselor that you would be willing to have sexual relations with someone if they wanted to have sex with you, just to be nice. And to me, that's when a counselor should dive in and help you set up boundaries. And in my case, when the counselor heard that I was having sexual relationships with girls, regardless of whether or not you're concerned about sexual, same-sex attraction, like that's not even in the picture. The fact is that children should not be having sexual relationships. And this narrative that's sort of part of the whole trans movement is the sexualization of kids, and for therapists to just sort of accept that young children are going to be sexual rather than helping them set up boundaries.
Yeah, and that's something that I struggled with a lot because of the sort of the sex ed that I had in school. And again, I went to high school between 2008 to 2013. This isn't recent, or it's not too recent. But this is, I think, before we had the homosexual sex ed in schools regularly and stuff like that. And I went to a church school. and we were basically kind of taught about contraception. We were not taught whatsoever about abstaining. Abstaining was not, in a church school as well, it was literally not even covered. It was not even mentioned. Saving yourself for marriage, or like only having sex in a sort of marital relationship or a lifelong partnership was just completely, that's an outdated concept, is what they kind of were making out.
And that's in a church school 10 years ago.
We played a board game when I was in, I think, year 10 or 11, probably about 15. And this was a sex ed lesson, and it was basically the sex ed board game. And we would ask each other questions on cards about different contraceptions and how effective they were. And there was a particular card that you could pull that meant that you had to put a condom on the dildo in the middle of the board, which was, that's the sex education I got. Not a single bit of it was, you can say no. Not a single bit of it was, you can have a fulfilling relationship with somebody without having sex with them. There wasn't, there was, you can have friends and you can have a romantic relationship, which is inherently sexual. There was no kind of, you can have a close spiritual bond with somebody without it being a sexual thing. And there was certainly no, if somebody wants to have sex with you and you don't want to do that yet, you've got that right. There was no information on that.
As you're talking about this, I'm thinking, no wonder so many girls are taking on a male identity, because I can't imagine. If you got that kind of education, 10 years ago at a religious school, what kind of education are the kids getting now? I know that a lot of these comprehensive sexuality education programs are starting in kindergarten and encouraging kids to be sexual, and that whole notion that sex is fun, that it's sort of like any other hobby, and these kids are not being taught that they have the right to say no, and that it's inappropriate for someone to push them into having sex, and that in fact their bodies aren't actually ready to have sex when they're children.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of it, is sexual maturity. And I think there's this notion going around that you're born with like an innate sexuality, and that just makes no sense to me. What small infant is kind of capable of wanting to have sex or having
or
sex,
even understanding the implications? And part of consent is knowing the full implications of a behavior, which is why we don't allow children to have medical consent, because they don't have the ability to think long term about the implications and the pros and cons of a medical intervention. And the same is true of sex, that there are consequences to having sex.
I think the concept of birth control has kind of eradicated that in people's minds a lot. And realistically, sex between a male and a female, a consequence that should be expected is life. No contraceptive can be 100% like accurate and 100% a contraceptive. And that is one of the fundamental points of sex. And that's been removed, because now it's, like you say, it's a hobby rather than something that has a biological purpose. And it's being seen as a need. It's being seen as you have a right to have sex.
Right. Yeah. I'm seeing sexual rights like it's some kind of inherent right that we're born with, that children should be able to have sex, which is just deeply just disturbing to me. And one of the things that I wonder is that starting children on birth control at a young age sort of paved the way to accept children getting access to hormones. I know that when I was between 13 and 14, I was able to walk into Planned Parenthood and get birth control pills without my parents' permission or knowledge. And that almost like opened the door now, all these years later, to kids walking into these clinics and getting cross-sex hormones without their parents' permission or knowledge.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting you mentioned birth control there, because obviously I started taking testosterone when I was 18, sorry. And actually, for a while before that, like I said, I kind of drifted between gender roles and tried to experiment, because I was encouraged to experiment with my gender. And that was the kind of thing, you know, it was like, try presenting as a male and see if, you know, if you're happy when someone calls you a guy, then maybe you are transgender, that kind of thing. And something that I kind of became really uncomfortable about was my menstrual period, because I started having that when I was a really young age compared to most girls. And it was something that I didn't manage to associate myself with.
I don't think very many teenage girls do. It's, and even women, it's it's a yucky, I mean,
yeah,
you don't feel good. It sort of is a crummy couple days in your every month that you have to deal with. And if you start it when you're little, it's even, you know, a bigger
alienating. You know, if all your friends are guys and you're on your period, you don't want them to know. But I think that there was something that I did to deal with that when I was like about 14, 15 years old. And I actually went to my doctor and got the birth control pill under the premise that I was using it to sort of regulate my hormone levels and my mood. And I got I think, which one is it? Is it there's two pills. One of them, you need to stop taking it for a week. And I got that one and then never took the week off. So I basically never allowed myself to have a period for months on end. And that was, to me, that was like taking hormone blockers. That was my equivalent. That was what I could do. And I was learning through that process that I can control my body. And that was a really dangerous thing to do, because then when I took testosterone and I didn't have a period, it was, this is normal, this can be healthy, because it can happen when I'm taking female hormones as well. And the doctors prescribe it to me. So of course it's, you know, it's not an unhealthy thing to do.
So when you started taking testosterone, did doctors talk to you about the fact that you would be basically going through menopause, I think, and some of the side effects that you had? Did they give you good information?
They gave me, I think, as good information as they had. But realistically, the word menopause never came up. So I was told, you know, I signed a disclaimer when I actually started taking testosterone on the NHS, which basically said that there was a potential association with certain types of cancer, but it hadn't been proven. And that I may experience an increase in sex drive, growing a beard, male secondary sex characteristics, like putting muscle on. I may experience like the shifting of my weight, receding hairline, balding, the ceasing of my menstrual period. That was it. There was no, and maybe like they did include like the high blood pressure, but there was no kind of reference to why any of this was happening. I didn't even discover that it could cause me to have menopausal symptoms like hot flashes, which was actually something I then went on to experience at the age of, I think, 20 or 21. And I had to Google that, and I had to do so much research online because I couldn't get past any of the, you know, this is okay stuff, to kind of get to why am I having hot flashes at the age of 20, 21, when in my mind I was a male. So I was like, that just doesn't make sense.
That's really confusing, because you had really bought into the narrative that you were a male.
Yeah, I genuinely, I think it was, they call it transmed. So you like genuinely believe that a transgender person has the anatomical, biological brain of the opposite sex, that it's an intersex disorder. And so I believed that I had XY chromosomes somewhere in my body. And if they weren't XY chromosomes, then there was something else that marked it genetically as male in my body. And that this just couldn't be proven because we don't have the correct research methods.
And back then, I bet it was really difficult to find good information, because it's still hard to find good information. But thanks to people like you who are speaking out, we're starting to develop some better resources for kids who want to find out what's going on. So besides the hot flashes, what did you experience when you started taking testosterone?
Right. Yeah. So the first thing, I stopped having periods.
Which you were probably thrilled about.
Yep, I loved that. But I just didn't even have to worry about that ever again when I started taking it. My voice dropped considerably. It's actually gone back up now, which is something that apparently, like, I heard was not a thing. But yeah, I developed an Adam's apple. I grew a full beard, body hair, like all over my body, thick, dark body hair. My breasts kind of went down about 4 cup sizes. I got really muscular and skinny. So, like, when I actually looked at my body when I stopped taking testosterone, I realized how skinny I was and how, like, underweight I was, because I was actually taking steroids, which made my metabolism increase, and it made my sex drive increase, and it made my appetite increase, just all sorts of different kinds of things. And it also made my hairline recede just a little bit. So I was really fortunate that that didn't go back any further. It slimmed my face right down as well. So I ended up with a very masculine jawline, a very masculine face, which is kind of rounded out now. I've been off the hormones for about 5.5 months now. But I think when I was first detransitioning, I looked like a man in drag.
Well, and that's one of the things that I've heard from some of the other women who have detransitioned, especially because of the voice, that they now are, people think that they're actually a man who's trying to pass as a woman. And I can't imagine how frustrating and confusing that would be to have to explain to people that you're actually a woman, even though you kind of look more like a man. And these things just get so complicated. And you mentioned your voice. I think that especially people who start on testosterone before they're through puberty, their voice tends not to drop back down. So that's something that that's been different for you. You've only been off for 5 months. So what did you notice right afterwards? Was it a difficult experience coming off the hormones?
Well, for me, and I know a lot of people sort of detransition for different reasons. For me, it was like an incredibly faith-motivated decision. So it was literally, I had this conviction from God that, you know, people shouldn't be doing these things, that you shouldn't be mutilating your body in this way. And it was, you know, I got this kind of conviction that was just stop taking the hormones, stop doing these things to your body. Like, I've given you a way to naturally run your body without taking anything. You don't need this. And that's when I said, okay, I'll give this to God. I will not need hormones, even though I feel like I need them. And then the next one was, you need to start living as a woman again. And at this point, I was taking a testosterone where I needed an injection once every 12 weeks. And my last injection was probably about 6 weeks prior. So I had a whole 6 weeks to kind of wait for it to come out of my system. And then there'd still be, like, you know, it needed to kind of wear off for a while. So I started taking the contraceptive pill. And I got that prescribed by my doctor really easily. And I took that for about the first 5 months. I took that. But like I say, it was a really faithful journey. So the whole month or so that I spent basically not having any way to not look like a man, I spent that month praying every single day. I would wake up and I would put worship music on my speakers. I would be like, okay, God, what are we praying about today? What scripture are we reading today? I've got a whole list of different scriptures and questions that I asked God, and different things that I learned in that time, which was an amazing experience for my faith. And I was also learning just how little the external meant, just how little my appearance meant when it came to, all I want to do is praise God. God sees me as a woman, whether I look like one or not, whether I function in this female way of society or biology, whatever. God sees me because he made me that way. When I actually came off the hormones, I had a really strange spiritual experience, because it was, I got the pills and the doctor said you can start taking them today. And so
And was the motivation behind those pills to give you sort of a jump start, give your system a jump start on estrogen?
Yeah, I started to get a bit worried that perhaps I would have gone through menopause, or I would end up going through menopause. And so I wanted to kind of make sure that my estrogen levels kind of were at a normal range as quickly as possible. And as well, like, I was kind of worried about getting really bad symptoms of my hormones being completely in flux. So I was like, okay, I'm going to take the pill to regulate things, which a lot of people take the pill to do that, a lot of women. So I thought I'll just take it, and then I will have a more regular menstrual cycle. I won't be kind of like erratic when it comes to that, if that comes back, which could be really detrimental to my routine. And also I can avoid things like the effects of having low hormones in your body, like fatigue, for example, which is something I did struggle with for a couple of weeks. But
do you know yet whether or not your body's capable of producing estrogen at this point?
At this point, I've been off the hormones for off the estrogen for about 4 weeks. I don't know for sure. I'm waiting any day to see if my menstrual cycle still happens off the pills. But it has happened while I was on them. So there are good signs.
And one of the things that as you're talking just concerns me is the risk of breast cancer for women who go off or go on testosterone, because the fewer menstrual cycles that you have, the more your risk of breast cancer increases. And so, that's one of the things that doctors look at, as well as osteoporosis. And, there's a lot of things that happen. So, which is why it's important for our bodies, that's, our hormones are produced for a reason. It helps regulate our bodies. And so when I hear you talking, I just keep thinking about how sad it is that girls and women and men they're not told the importance of their hormones and how those hormones help their body to function healthy.
Yeah, well, it's seen as a choice. I think I remember being taught at one point that both men and women have both testosterone and estrogen, and therefore, like, because they're just in different levels, you can just increase and decrease the levels of each of them, and it's not something that will affect one sex differently than it will affect the other.
Yeah, it's ironic because I've talked to endocrinologists, and one of their main jobs is to work with people whose hormones are out of whack. So women who are producing testosterone and men who are producing estrogen because there's a tumor or some other disorder, and they treat it aggressively because we know that cross-sex hormones in our bodies at high levels are really unhealthy. As you mentioned, both males and females have a balance of estrogen and testosterone, but that's the key, is that there's a natural balance, and the amount of testosterone and estrogen required to push someone to look like the opposite sex is much higher than would even occur generally in someone of that sex. They're using just huge amounts of hormones.
Yeah, and it's really upsetting that that's actually something that's used by activists to kind of support transgender ideology, and it supports sort of the medical ideology of transgenderism, where I remember like being taught, well, there are intersex people, there are people with these hormone imbalances. And even in a theological way, I was taught by some really liberal sort of Christians that that God made all these different, this whole rainbow array of gender and this whole spectrum because God loves diversity, and therefore transgenderism fits into that. And it's so damaging because the thing is, women who have low estrogen levels are at higher risk for things like polycystic ovaries and uterine problems and ruptures and these really
Significant health problems.
Yeah, and men that have a low level of testosterone are at a massively higher risk for things like anxiety and depression, even compared to other men with mental health issues. They're at a higher risk for sort of bone density issues, for heart problems, ironically, because in women, I remember reading that there's a gene actually that's carried in a female body that is able to kind of regulate the effect that estrogen has on your cholesterol levels and heart rate that the male body does not have. So
and I think that that's so important is that male and female bodies are different at every level. Michelle Cretella, who's a been very outspoken about this, is a doctor, and she talks about how every cell of our body is either male or female. Even people who are intersex, they either have an XY, they either have a Y gene or they don't. So if you have a Y gene, you're biologically a male. If you don't have a Y gene, you're biologically female, even with people who have disorders of sexual development. And every cell in our body is either male or female. And so how we respond to medications, how we exhibit things like heart attacks is different, that we're fundamentally different. And so to say that we can just tinker with these chemicals, these hormones in our system, and it'll be fine is just it's so scary to me, because we have younger and younger kids as young as 8 years old now being put on cross-sex hormones, and we have no idea what the long-term effects are going to be, but we do know it's not going to be good. It's not going to promote health.
And it affects the developing morality as well. So if you consider morality as literally just somebody's sense of right and wrong, somebody's sense of this is something that's okay to do, this is something that's not okay to do, and this is where I draw the line. Everybody has some kind of individual morality. And it is so influenced by your parents, by your caregivers, by doctors and nurses that you may be around when you're at that age. If you're taught when you're 8 years old that it is moral and it is okay to give children cross-sex hormones, and you start taking those cross-sex hormones, then you grow up to believe that. It's like when I was younger, I was taught that if you're transgender, you're born that way. And it took me, from the time I was taught that, at least, what would it be, like 14 years to like completely not like unlearn that kind of behavior.
And that was actually something I wanted to ask you about, because I think that people have bought into this idea that being transgender is something inherent, that it's appropriate for you to hate your body so much that you feel like you're flawed. And you mentioned that you made a choice, and that you decided that you were going to accept yourself as female. And I wanted to explore that a little bit, because I think we're teaching kids that they don't have power and choice anymore. that they're sort of born with these afflictions, sexual orientation, gender identity, all kinds of things. They're just born that way, and there's nothing that they can do about it. And I think that that's really disempowering to kids. And it's sort of done in this effort to empower kids in a weird way. And yet it's, when you start telling people that there's nothing they can do about their issues, that they're just stuck with them and they should just sort of, resolve to accept the fact that there's something very wrong with them. And it's concerning because I think I bought into that narrative as a kid. And when I finally realized that I could make choices about how I think and feel, that I could actually change the way I feel based on the thoughts that I allow myself to think, and that I could, basically change the self-talk that I have within my head, that changed my life so much and just gave me this huge sense of control. And it's helped it's helped in every aspect of my life, that sense of, oh, I have influence over my feelings. I don't have to be controlled by them.
I have influence over who I am. I have influence over my perception of myself. And I think you make a really good point, and it's something that really, I feel like mentally it beat me down as a teenager, being indoctrinated into that sort of ideology, or being taught that ideology, was I actually believed that other people's perception of me should have an effect on how I feel. Because that is the whole, if you take that away, transition is nothing. Because the whole of transition is, well, I need to make people perceive me as a male. Like, for instance, in my situation, I need to make people perceive me as a male, and therefore I will be happy.
And therefore you will be a male, perceive you as a male.
Yeah. And this is the biggest lie that I kind of broke. I remember there was a big part of my kind of conviction to detransition kind of process was being in a preach that was happening at a church, and like it was a midweek preach that I attended, and I'd actually, oddly enough, I prayed the night before because I'd received my genuine conviction the night before that I should detransition, and I'd prayed at exactly, I think it was exactly 1 a.m. I said, Lord, I don't know who's going to preach tomorrow. It's a guest preacher, but whoever it is, can you just make them change what they're about to preach about right now, right this second? Give them a revelation that they need to preach about something different. And then when I go to it, it's going to be something relevant to me. And it was this guy from America, some preacher from America, and he came and he stood at the front of the church, and he said, I had a preach prepared, but I fast about 12 to 24 hours before I come and preach in a church. And I was fasting last night, and I was sat at 1 a.m. in my car, and the Holy Spirit just came to me and said, you're not going to preach about that, you're going to preach about this. And he'd never met me before, he didn't know I was transgender, and I told him about that, and he was like, wow, bro, that's amazing, because he genuinely still thought I was a dude. And he did this massive preach on, I think it's Isaiah 45, like the first 3 verses say something like the Lord will make a way for you, Cyrus, and the name Cyrus means son. And he did this whole explanation on this preach, and he said, double doors are going to open, and you don't just get one thing through, but you get both through. So you're trying to get a couch through a door, a double door is a lot better than just opening one of the double doors and trying to fit it through one side. And that just brought this huge revelation to me that, like, hang on, say, for instance, I do have this internal gender as a male that God gave me. I also have this external sex as a female that God also gave me. Why can't I embrace both of them? Why can't I be female and biologically female and have that literally just a descriptor of my reproductive system and my body, and have male be just a descriptor of a piece of my identity or a piece of my personality, which is just as important, the person that I am, as the body that I have and the way that I traverse this world. That was my first revelation, that I went, hang on, I can just, what if that's all that female is? What if all that female is just, I have a female body and I'm just going to let it do its thing?
It's
And
so
that was,
interesting that you
yeah,
say that because, you know, one of the reasons that, I mean, I think that if I were in the right crowds, you know, if I hung out with people who were very much into the whole transgender ideology, it would be easy for them to convince me that I still was transgender because I, the way I think is different than a lot of women. I am a very quirky female. You know, I like science fiction. I like number patterns. I forget important dates and anniversaries and birthdays. I sort of, a lot of the very typical male behavior. And yet I'm very much a female. I've had 3 children, so I know I'm a
yeah,
woman, you know? And so I think that that's what's so frustrating is the idea that if you have, if you're, and that's in some ways the most frustrating thing is that people say that they're embracing diversity and yet they're not, because they're not embracing the fact that women can have all kinds of ways of thinking and being and behaving and still be women. Instead, we're saying, if you don't fit in this box, you're actually male. So it's almost like they're saying they embrace diversity, but in fact they're saying if you don't fit the stereotype of male or female, you're not one.
yeah. And that's, I think one thing that I think shocks people when I say it nowadays, I still fit the definition of transgender man in that ideology. Even though I am happy living as a female, even though I'm able to say very honestly and sincerely, I am female, I still think the same way that I did on like a deep personal level that I did when I was living as a male. You know, if I woke up tomorrow and had a biologically male body, I'd be like, cool, let's go out through my day, same as I do. Like, I realized through transition that nothing changed. My
You're
mental
still
health,
you.
like, because I got older and I learned to deal with my anxiety and my depression. I learned to process the traumas that I'd been through. And I knew the whole time I was transitioning that that was a separate thing to my dysphoria. But
And a lot of people have dysphoria. I mean, there are a lot of people who have dysphoria about all different kinds of things. Women particularly have dysphoria about being overweight. And so it's not uncommon for people to feel very uncomfortable about how they look. That's pretty normal. And I feel like it's really important as a society for us to tell kids that it's important to become comfortable with how you look rather than trying to change how we look. Otherwise, we're going to be encouraging, you know, girls who just aren't comfortable with how they look having plastic surgery. And it sort of to me undermines the whole goal that we should have as human beings to accept ourselves. Instead, this is a narrative about let's change ourselves.
yeah, where do you cap it off as well? Like, sure, you can have, for example, I wanted to have my breasts removed. I didn't have any surgeries, thankfully, but I wanted to have that happen. I wanted to have lower surgery to construct male genitalia, or what appeared to be male genitalia. But I've known as well, I've known transgender women, like male to female transgender people, to then they do that and they undergo kind of like, they get the Adam's apple shaved down, they get facial reconstruction surgery, and that's like a fairly normal part of that as well, because of the effects that the male bone structure has. It's a lot harder for them to pass as the opposite sex. And then they'll have other kinds of surgeries as well, like hairline surgery to
They
put
just
hairline.
keep trying to, and
Yeah.
they never get there.
And how far does it go? How far does that go to the point where, well, there are women who, especially after getting pregnant, develop a visible Adam's apple. Do we schedule all sort of new mothers to get their Adam's apple shaved down? Do we decide that any woman with a small chest needs to have breast implants, or to have the opportunity to have breast implants? Do we do laser hair removal for women who have hairy arms naturally? You know, and do we provide that on our public health system?
Well, and it seems like we should, if we're accepting this narrative. For some reason, someone who's transgender is entitled to have cosmetic surgery to make them feel more comfortable about themselves, but someone who isn't transgender isn't allowed to have that surgery. To me, that seems like it's very discriminatory against somebody who's not transgender, that we, for some reason, have to find peace with how we look externally, but they don't.
Yeah. And I think as well, that's the thing that really upsets me the most about it, is how much are you not dealing with when you're getting surgery to deal with your psychological issues? Because it's a dissociative disorder at its core when you get to gender dysphoria. And personally, I like the term gender identity disorder, in the sense that that's how you would describe transgenderism as a whole. Dysphoria is just a symptom of it. That's the deep discomfort. But the actual transgenderism and being transgender on that kind of level of what that experience was like, it's a dissociative thing. It's, I look in the mirror and I can't recognize myself. I mean, thankfully, I'm at a point where I can associate with myself enough to recognize myself most of the time when I look in the mirror. But, you know, it's that kind of like, I have out of body experiences or something like that. Like, I used to have out of body experiences when somebody would call me she. And strangely enough, when I transitioned, that got worse, because I was so accustomed to people calling me he. If somebody misgendered me, you know, if they gendered me as a female when I, for example, wasn't on the hormones yet or something, it would be like my soul would leave out of my body almost, and it would be this really weird experience. And it was more intense than it had been beforehand.
So interesting that you say that. I'm thinking about, because I have that dissociation too. I much less now, but I used to have it really regularly, where I just felt like I was leaving my body for a while. And what it occurs to me is that people who have this experience, who are identifying as transgender, are not getting the appropriate mental health services that they need. It's like we are putting a Band-Aid on a wound that is gushing within and pretending like that wound doesn't exist. And these poor people are not getting the help that they need, because there are therapeutic techniques that can help people who have dissociative disorder, who can help them with anxiety and depression. You know, we do have therapeutic techniques to help with this, but if we tell someone that their anxiety and dissociation and depression is normal, and that they just need to change their external appearance, we're completely giving them the wrong treatment.
Yeah, I think I liken it to sort of a broken bone. So if I broke my leg now and I went to the hospital, they would put my leg in a cast, my leg would heal, and they'd take the cast away. But that doesn't mean I didn't break my leg. And I think the transgender narrative is basically like getting somebody who's broken their leg and giving them a bunch of kind of like little decorations on their leg and like a walking stick, and telling them that they can put pressure on the leg just the same. And then when that leg becomes gangrene and it's all horrible and stuff, you know they're really suffering. But that person then whose leg is healed, it's like them turning around to that person and saying, no, you never had a broken leg. Look, this is what my broken leg is. You never had one.
If you had a broken leg, you would know that this is what it looks like. And yeah, that's the thing that I think is so interesting, is that people will say that those who either desisted or detransitioned, they were never really trans. Or the other one is that it's internalized transphobia, and that they will never really be happy until they transition. And it's such a strange narrative that they insist that they get to define themselves, but then they also insist that they get to define those of us who are trying to redefine ourselves as our true selves.
Yeah, I remember I've had a number of kind of weird responses to my detransition. And I've like said from the very beginning, like, I don't expect other people to do what I'm doing. I don't, I don't say to people, you can't live as transgender now, because I'm not doing that. But the fact that this is my story and this is what I've been through, I've got one team of people that say you'll never find peace and you're denying everything and you're brainwashed and it's all horrible for you. And then another group of people that are saying, oh, so you were just never really transgender, but what about the real transgender people? And it's like, I'm one, if I'm one or the other, like, I can't be both. But perhaps maybe I am just a biological female who has suffered with gender dysphoria and now is working to accept my body for what it is.
And that's what I think is so sad, is that the trans activists are insisting that this is not a mental health issue. And yet, for those of us who have experienced it and recognize it, it is so profoundly obvious that it's a mental health issue.
Yeah, I think the painful thing is as well, because I transitioned so long ago, or because I learned about transgenderism so long ago, I almost feel like there was something about me that was like old school transgender. So, and there are a few people like that on YouTube making YouTube videos, and I would follow them for a while, the conservative transgender people. And it was, the people who would actively say, if I could choose to be born and identify with my birth sex, I'd be happy with that. They're the people that say gender dysphoria is a mental health disorder. That is how it should be categorized, but transition's the only way that we have to deal with it. And it was, I kind of got to this point where I was like, well, if I know God, I know another way to, I know someone who can do miracles, even though I don't believe the dysphoria can go away other than transition. God can make that happen. And that was my changing revelation. But there are transgender people that will admit this is something that is a mental health disorder, but we're not actually progressing and doing the research to try and figure out how we can help trans people through talking therapy, because it's being banned, because it's being, because we're not allowed to do that, because people are telling us that that's abuse.
Which is really scary, because people who do go through the full medical transition have much higher rates of suicide completions and other mental health issues. And so it's shocking to me that we're encouraging people down a path that we know has negative outcomes, rather than helping them to resolve or manage those dysphoric feelings.
Yeah, and it's political at its heart as well. It's not, it's basically this kind of, I believe this, so everybody else has to believe this. And even if I were to turn around when, in November, when I was convicted to detransition, if I wanted therapy for that, it would be incredibly difficult for me to access, just like it was impossible for me to access when I was 12, and that's what I wanted. Because the affirmation therapy is widely accepted, but the actual therapy to help you identify with your birth sex, even if you choose that, even if you say, these are unwanted feelings, I want to try and work through them.
You can't find anybody.
You're called a hater, you're called a bad person, you're called an abuser.
They're banned in a lot of places in the US. I'm not sure about the UK.
They're trying to push for it, yeah.
And to me, that's horrible, that we would limit access to therapy for services for people who actually are actively trying to get help to resolve these feelings.
Yeah. It's really kind of painful for me, because as well, I've got people, say on my Facebook account, I've got friends from, Facebook is great because you can have friends that span like 10 years of your life that you don't talk to anymore, but you kind of see their posts every now and then. And I've got so many people that they kind of dwindle a little bit lately. But do you have those people that say like conversion therapy is horrible, and they post these articles that are kind of spreading these lies that it's like electric shock therapy and ice pick lobotomies and all these kind of, it's
They don't
not
have a clue.
like, yeah. And they're also not considering the perspective of someone like me or like you, for example, who, you know, would receive help from getting that kind of therapy. I'm honestly, I feel like I'm incredibly fortunate to be a Christian, to believe in and have a relationship with the Holy Spirit, and to have that counsel on a spiritual level without needing it to come from another human being necessarily.
Yeah, because I think if you, I mean, at least in a lot of places, it's incredibly hard to find a therapist who would help you with that, and so you really do have to turn either to a community or to God or to something else, because you're not going to be able to find people who will accept you as someone who's recognizing gender dysphoria as needing to be resolved rather than to transition.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's why, like, yeah, I feel really fortunate to have this, and I feel a lot of pain for the people that don't have that, because I know through just logical deduction rather than anything else, like, and also, you know, I've seen certain people posting things on YouTube about their stories, and they're not Christians, they're secular, they're atheists, and a lot of the things that they struggle with, and they can't get counseling to deal with those things, or in order to get counseling to deal with those things, they have to conform to the idea that they were never really transgender, which is basically kind of denying an experience in somebody's life, which is really painful. And to be honest, that's something that I would have thought that transgender ideology and the way that it promotes this sort of work would be so against, would be having this idea that we're going to deny this whole part of your life. You know, I lived as a man for 6 years, and in that whole time, you know, I completed sixth form education, I started a university course, I had birthdays, I had Christmases, I made friends, I met people who didn't know until very recently that I was transgender, and I lived that whole 6 years of my life with a different name, with different pronouns, finding my chest every single day, experiencing horrible dysphoria, having a painful injection every 12 weeks, having blood tests, going back and forth into a different county to go to the gender identity clinic. Like, so many experiences that I'm not willing to deny, and I'm not willing to say that that didn't happen to me. And I'm not willing to say as well that the struggles that I had when I was living as a female before that period are not validated, because they are just as real as any other person who chooses to transition and is still transitioning.
Well, and if you weren't transgender, then how come you were allowed access to testosterone? I mean, that's the fundamental question that I have for people, is, especially with children, is that they're saying that people who detransitioned were never really transgender, and yet you were able to access cross-sex hormones. And so in that case, the healthcare professionals are not able to determine who's a real transgender and who isn't, and they probably should stop medicating people.
That's absolutely true. And to kind of reinforce that point, I remember my diagnosis for gender dysphoria, which I got when I was about 18. And it was, it was something that was basically just for formality's sake, because it was already kind of accepted amongst me and my doctors that I had gender dysphoria and that I was transgender. And I remember my appointment where I got my diagnosis from a clinical psychologist, and she said the exact words, "You passed with flying colors."
Wow.
I was a textbook transgender man. I was not on the edge. I was not, there was no doubt or uncertainty as to whether I was genuinely transgender, whatever that is. Like, I had all the symptoms. I didn't lie about anything. I was completely upfront about any of the abuse, trauma, anything that I'd been through, and any mental health issues I was still going through. I didn't hide anything. I was completely upfront and completely honest. And I still got the diagnosis. And not only did I get the diagnosis, but I got a very clean cut, very textbook diagnosis.
Wow. That to me just really highlights the fact that these healthcare professionals don't know what they're doing. I mean, they really, and that they certainly should not be medicating kids because they really don't know what they're doing.
Yeah. If I was a child as well, like if you made my story, what is a lot of children's stories, sort of like 10 years in advance of what mine was, being 2 years old when you kind of say, oh, mommy, I'm a boy. Like, if you made it that, then I'd be 7 years old getting a diagnosis for gender dysphoria, being put on puberty blockers, and then it'd be a lot easier to kind of like, I'd be a lot more malleable when it came to believing that doctrine, believing that ideology. By the time that I'm now 23 years old, I would have probably never developed breasts. I would have never got a period. I would have been, I probably would have had the atrophy of my reproductive organs. I would have much less hair on my head. I would have a much lower voice probably. And it may not, like you said, at that age, it may not come back up. And these kinds of things, we don't consider that the child is a child, and even adults are regretting the decision to transition. Like,
Yeah, if someone like you is
universe.
regretting it, I'm thinking about me when I was 7 years old. If my school psychologist had said, "Oh, she's transgender," rather than she wants to be a boy. So if I had gotten that affirmative treatment at, I was 5 and 6 years old, I would have started puberty blockers and gone on cross-sex hormones if I had that experience today, and you would have too. We both would have been permanently damaged.
Yeah, absolutely. That really is the painful thing that I think about, because not only that, but I think when I transitioned, at least I learned all that kind of doctrine at a point when it was a lot further back. What it is now is, you can be male, you can be female, you can be something in between. And even the non-binary thing, which has kind of come up recently, is, I feel like it's really interesting to me that that's come up, because to me that feels like people started asking the question when they discovered transgenderism, oh, am I transgender? And then they came with the answer based on the ideology. Well, by this definition, I'm not sure if I'm male or I'm female, because I don't fit into either exactly.
Which I would suspect like 99% of people don't fit into that absurd explanation of what male and female is. Exactly. So according to the narrative, we're all non-binary.
And you've got people who, they're girls, for example, who take male hormones because they identify as non-binary, and they want you to know that they're not going to give themselves like this reverse dysphoria by taking hormones, and then they're absolutely fine with how they are still. And you think, does that not tell you that, it's not going to be like I made a big mistake, oh no, I wanted to wear dresses and heels and I just thought that I was a man?
Well, and that's the funny thing, when I hear a lot of these men who say they're non-binary want to take estrogen, and I'm thinking, well, if you're non-binary, why would you want to why are you insisting on presenting as female? Like, it really has just gotten so convoluted. And I think it's because when you start teaching kids these lies, they don't have a reality. They don't have anything to base their belief systems on that makes sense. So it's not surprising that we have this whole generation of kids that's just completely confused about what sex is, what gender is, what their role is, how they should behave, whether or not they're okay the way they are. And so they're just embracing this trans umbrella. And if they're under that trans umbrella, then they're going to be okay. Then they're going to be accepted. Then they're going to be tolerated no matter what. But if they're not under that trans umbrella, then they don't have protection.
That's true. Is that the idea of protection as well is such a huge thing, that there are so many people in my life that I didn't identify in the LGBT community. I've never been to a pride parade in person. I've seen them on videos or whatever, but I've not, in my town itself, I live in a small town and it has its own pride parade, and I've never been to a pride parade. I totally rejected the LGBT community when I was transgender, because to me, I didn't identify as transgender, I identified as male. And I was going to be male, I wasn't going to be a trans man.
Which
And
indicates to me that of all the people, you actually were, like they said, textbook gender dysphoric. Like
yeah,
that's textbook gender dysphoric. And that's what I think is so frustrating, is that it's gotten so convoluted now. So you have men who are insisting that they're women, and yet they're also holding on to the transgender identity, because that allows them to sort of become identified as marginalized, and gives them in some weird way this power to be able to speak as a trans woman, which is for some reason of higher position than just being a woman.
yeah, that's true. I think being able to speak as transgender because your voice is more heard is such a huge thing. Like when I was living as a trans man, if I wanted to be famous, I could have done that in any career I wanted. Because I could have literally, like, I could have started a YouTube channel. I did actually have a YouTube channel when I was about 14 years old, shortly before my mum died. And I took it down when my mum died, actually. But, and I think it was called something like 14-year-old trans guy or something like that. And literally within about a couple of days, I had 70 odd subscribers. Like, it was, you know, I could have made myself famous because I was speaking from the perspective of being transgender. And that's what people want to hear.
And now you're speaking as a detransitioner, and people, at least if your experience is similar to mine and some of my other guests, they're trying to shut you down and silence you.
Absolutely. I've had people that, you know, like I said, I've got friends who don't want to be friends with me anymore. And I've got friends, like people that I spoke to maybe like one sentence, that we had a lot of mutual friends. And so I accepted a friend request from them like 4 years ago or something. Attempt to like completely psychoanalyze me and tell me why I transitioned and why I detransitioned, and they're not asking me questions, they're telling me what their version of the story is because they need to rationalize it to fit their agenda, to fit their ideology.
It must be so frustrating.
Yeah, it is, but it's also, I think it was one of my kind of early convictions to detransition. I was reading my Bible, and there's a scripture, and the thought appears many times in the Bible in different ways. But this particular scripture was saying, if you're hated for doing God's work, then that's good. You know, it's better to be hated for doing what God wants you to do than it is to be hated for being a thief or an idolater or any of these sinful things.
Or to be loved for being disingenuous.
Yeah. And that whole theme though, just that idea, I knew at a certain point I'm going to be hated by someone no matter what I do. If I transition, there is going to be some like really extreme right-wing person that's telling me that I am some abomination and some horrible person, or that I'm sexually deviant or something. Which none of those things are true of people that transition. I kind of want to make that point that I love all people, and I think God loves all people, whether you are transgender, whether you are gay, whether you are straight, whether you are not living in any of those kinds of lifestyles. But I'm going to be hated no matter what I do. If I detransition, I have to be honest about my story of struggling with gender dysphoria and having been transgender. And if I'm transgender, I need to be honest about the fact that I was born female. And somebody's going to hate me for either of those things. So which one am I going to pick? Which one is more sincere? Which one is the side of the battle that I want to be on?
I really like how you put that. As we finish up, is there anything that you wanted to say that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
I think there's just one kind of phrase that sort of really helped me. And so if anybody's kind of wants to look into detransitioning, look into if they are detransitioning and they're really struggling at the moment. One phrase that kind of I have written really big on a notebook is, you define female, not the other way around. And the same goes for guys, you define male. It's not the other way around. Whatever you do is the definition of what your sex does. You have that integrity and that control as a God-given right. You define who you are by what you do, not you are defined by it. So
I really like that. I think that's like recognizing the integrity of biology, and that as biological females, you and I get to define what it means to be female. And as biological males, they get to define what it means to be male. But a biological female does not get to define what it means to be male, and a biological male does not get to define what it means to be female.
yeah, and that's literally anybody who's kind of struggling with anything like that. That is the one thing that I would say. If you're confused about your gender, if you've just approached this transgenderism, which I'm sure a lot of people who kind of come across your videos, maybe they are just kind of asking what is transgenderism, and they come across this video. If you're somebody who has done that, like, I want you to know that you can have integrity in the body that you were born in. You do not need to define yourself based on somebody else's ideology. And that's, yeah.
And that anything that encourages you to harm your body isn't healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. You, bar a few sort of very unlikely scenarios, like, you have a body that is capable of running and doing its own thing. You don't have to manipulate that into trying to do something else. Like, your body is capable of being healthy by itself, and as much as you can, allow your body to be healthy by itself without needing to take something that could do a lot of harm to you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I'm excited for you. I think that when I talk to you, I have a sense that you have a really good internal peace that that's sometimes hard to find after going through as much as you've gone through. And I really appreciate you being willing to share your story.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad that you have me here. Like, the videos that you post have actually really helped me out when it comes to sort of understanding and decoding the whole transgender narrative that have been ingrained into me. So I'm just really excited to have been here and been able to speak to you and actually speak to you like one-to-one. That's been really great.